Good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Saba Karim Khan. A very warm welcome to the Lahore Literary Festival. It is an absolute privilege to be in conversation with Monica Ali. Monica is the author of 5 books. Her work has been translated into 26 languages. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. And Monica has been nominated for a staggering slate of book prizes, including the Booker Prize, the George Orwell Prize, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and in the US, she's been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the LA Times Book Prize. Monica's also taught creative writing at Columbia University, and she was Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Surrey. Monica, a very warm welcome to Lahore and to LLF. What a surreal sight and how exciting.
Oh, well, it's so exciting for me. Thank you. Thank you. Is my microphone working?
Perfect,
yeah, good. I've had a great time so far in Lahore. I only arrived yesterday, and yesterday evening I had a lesson in Lahori hospitality because I was picked up from the hotel along with another writer, and we were going to a party, the LLF party, and the driver took us to the wrong house. Now, in London, if you arrive at the wrong house and expecting to be let in, you're out of your mind. If you did that in America and you drove up the driveway, you probably get shot. But in Lahore, we were welcomed with open arms. Oh. I mean, they weren't expecting us. They just let us in.
That is wonderful. Yeah, okay, so just before we begin, I want to say that there will be a book signing later. And so maybe right after the session, maybe 10 minutes or so later, Monica will be there to sign copies of her books. So, Monica, I guess I'm going to start at the start. I want to back up a little bit. And you've said that by the time you started what turned into Brick Lane, you had a toddler and a baby daughter. And as I was reading that, I was just telling Monica, my 2 small daughters are in the audience, and I was like, I hear you, it's completely crazy. And then you've sort of spoken about how you went to your grandfather's funeral, and the very next day you started penning down Brick Lane. And it's almost as if there was something quite strangely galvanizing about being at a funeral. This realization, perhaps, that our time is finite, that, the sense of mortality. So I want to start there. Talk to us a little bit about that moment, that realization that perhaps offered you clarity to take the plunge into storytelling.
Yeah, so, I've always been a big reader. That was my childhood, was largely spent with my head inside a book. I didn't grow up in a house with lots of books because I grew up poor. We couldn't afford books. Books were more expensive back then. But I had a library card, so that was my ticket to all these other worlds. But it didn't really occur to me for a very long time that writing might be something that I could do. It seemed out of the realm of possibility. But I think that I'd always harboured a secret desire and a dream to write. And then when I'd had my children, in fact, I started writing short stories first. When my son was born, I'd get up in the middle of the night because he'd woken me up and I couldn't get back to sleep. So I started writing short stories and I shared them on a forum with other writers, all anonymously. And that was really good for getting me into the habit and the discipline of writing. And I had this idea for a novel, but it didn't seem feasible. By that stage, I'd also had my daughter, still nursing my daughter. I had a toddler, didn't have any childcare. So I thought, it's not really the right time. I'm not going to be able to do it. Then, as you say, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, passed away. We went up to his funeral in the north of England, and then we had a few days away, just the 4 of us, and my husband very kindly took care of the kids. So I said I wanted to start writing this novel. Yeah. Like most husbands would say, right, really, you're kidding yourself. But he said, no, you should, something that you should try at least. And that's how I got started on Brick Lane. And I think it was that idea of you've got to seize the day because you never know how many days you have.
Now, Monica, in a lot of your work, I think something that your fans, your readers really enjoy, I certainly did, was that...
Let's stick with fans.
Let's stick with fans. It just sounds... I should have stopped there.
Joking.
I agree. So your fans are having a lot of fun, are enjoying the fact that you're having fun smashing a lot of these cultural clash cliches, and it's almost like you're doing away with this cookie-cutter lens of how we sometimes look at particular categories of people or cultures. So, for instance, in Brick Lane, you've really debunked this notion of the Muslim woman as just demure, inevitably desireless. We're getting something more nuanced. In Love Marriage, what I found interesting is that you've almost done away with this sense of any singular woman. There's so much there. And the title, too, comes into question. I mean, what does love marriage really mean? Is there a single meaning to that term? And I just found that there's so much beauty and potency in embracing that complexity and not trying to oversimplify, not trying to give the blacks and the whites. Talk to us a little bit about that in your storytelling.
Yeah, so, I mean, just on the title quickly of Love Marriage, I mean, in the UK, people don't really know what that means. I mean, here everybody knows what a love marriage is. But it's interesting, in the UK, until they read the book or I talked about it, nobody had a clue, because there, love marriage is the norm, right? And the other thing is called an arranged marriage, whereas everywhere on the subcontinent, arranged marriage is not called arranged marriage, it's marriage, and the other thing is a love marriage. So that sowed some confusion in the UK, but that's fine. I'm fine with, people not understanding straight off and having to dive into the complexity, as you say. So with Love Marriage, actually the protagonist, Yasmin, is engaged to be married to Joe. They're both junior doctors at a London hospital. They're from very different cultures and backgrounds. Yasmin's very worried about how her family, her parents, are going to receive Joe's mother, who is quite a fearsome individual. She's, a feminist, public intellectual, quite controversial figure, known for being very open about her sexual exploits in the past. And Yasmin is sort of mortified at the idea of these two very different worlds coming together. There's some class anxiety there, which in fact sort of is quite predominant, I've seen love marriage referred to as a clash of cultures. It's not that at all. Joe's mother, Harriet, to name her, actually embraces the Garami family, and she, they make a very close bond. Yasmin's mother and Joe's mother become friends, and Yasmin then is resentful that they are friends, and she questions the veracity of that friendship. Is Harriet treating Anisha like a pet, she's exotifying her, and so on and so on. And actually, Yasmin is largely mistaken in her views. She views her own mother through a particular lens, which is actually quite reductive. So again, it's about that the layers and layers of the character, and what you're seeing on the surface might not match up with what you're getting underneath.
Yeah, sure. I want to now move, Monica, to talking about writing from character, which you've spoken about, and kind of getting under the skin of the character. The name, the voice, the backstory all sort of feeds in. And, when you pick up a copy of Love Marriage, you'll realize that there are so many memorable characters in there, but the one that I really want to hone in on this afternoon are the characters of Baba and his son. And I want to talk about the relationship between this father and his son. Now, Baba is obviously somebody who seems to be tormented by quite a few hang-ups. He feels deep love for his children, but he's so consumed by this desire for them to succeed, for them to kind of prove themselves in some shape or form. He's also furious at his wife for different reasons. But, Monica, just staying on that strained, fraught relationship between father and son, which so many can relate to across the world, where the son then feels enraged and unwanted and underconfident. And, that festers and eventually reaches a boiling point without giving too much away. I want to talk about that relationship, about the push and the pull between what is said and left unsaid and what it means to just be manly. It's a brilliant example of writing from character. Talk to us about your way into exploring this relationship between Baba and his son.
Yeah, well, I spoke a little bit earlier today in another session about writing from character, and that is the way, along with other things like doing research, but primarily I write from character. So I spend a lot of time developing and creating the characters before I set pen on paper or actually type on a blank screen. And I think of it like a bit of an iceberg situation where you might only get the tip of the iceberg showing, as in what ends up on the page is a tiny percentage of what I've actually thought through. Yeah. So, what is Baba's background? A little bit of this comes up in the book, but, I have got to know him through his life story and where he's come from and the struggles that he's been through, so that I'm never in any doubt about, you plonk the character in a situation, you put them in a conflict, how are they going to act? Well, if you've done the deep work of building the character, you have a pretty good idea how they're going to act and react. And of course, sometimes they take the writer by surprise. It's not all. It doesn't feel all preordained. I don't feel constrained, but I feel that I've got enough closeness with them to have an understanding of how they might interact. And I'm so glad that you like Baba and Arif's relationship, because it's not an easy one, right? It's on the surface, it's one that's devoid of closeness and it's devoid of love, and it's all about Baba's rage, which can be quite extreme. I mean, there's an incident of violence in the book. It's a question mark about how much that was intended or not. But, it's that mismatch of expectations and reality and the push and pull between two men, because Arif's a young man, of wanting to take different paths in life. But underneath what's driving that anxiety, that Arif is a young Muslim man in a society that doesn't look that favourably on young Muslim men, and that is driving a lot of Baba's fears for Arif, in fact. So, I'm glad that you've seen that substrata of love coming through.
Yeah. And just staying on that, Monica, we've talked about getting your way into that character, but in general, if there are particularly dark or painful characters or themes to etch out in your storytelling, is there a way out, or does it never really leave you?
Do you mean, does it leave me feeling something, feeling sad, feeling... Yeah, I mean, there is a sort of... there can be an emotional journey that you take with your characters. I mean, at the end of the day, I do know that these are situations that I've created and fueled, and it's fiction. But again, if I'm not invested emotionally in the characters, I always think, how am I going to expect the reader to be emotionally invested in the characters? So one of the joys of writing for me is that it's like that left brain, right brain thing. You have to be... you have to use your intellect and your analytical skills. You have to be able to structure the novel. And that takes a great deal of, careful, sort of, is it left brain activity? And And then there's the more visceral aspect of writing, which comes from your gut, which comes from your heart. And those two things knitting together is what makes writing such a fulfilling, when it's going well, such a fulfilling thing to do, and so horrible when it's not going well.
Monica, let's talk a little bit about narrative privilege. And what I mean by that is this idea of telling stories about characters that sometimes lie at a departure from our own lives. And I want to specifically talk about Brick Lane here, because amidst all the adulation that it received, which was plenty, you have also been honest in saying that there were these smaller elements of resistance and, threats of book burnings and henceforth. Yeah. Perhaps not huge, but it's enough to sort of unsettle you, if you will. So talk to us a little bit about writing Brick Lane and what you had to stay mindful of as a storyteller when telling stories of people who may or may not have the privilege to tell their own stories. I mean, is that sort of where research comes in for that sensitivity check, but without getting paralyzed by it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, one aspect of writing that I enjoy a lot is doing the research, and I did a lot of research for Brick Lane. Naila Kabir's book about garment workers in the East End of London and in Dhaka. I mean, Naila, I know Naila, and she was very generous with her time in talking to me about her research from that book. And I did a lot of other reading. I also went on to the estates around Tower Hamlets, which is where Brick Lane is, and I talked to youth workers, social workers, spent time in women's groups, just talked to people who worked in the restaurants around there. So I gathered a lot of information. But then there does have to be that time when you put the research aside and you have to make the imaginative leaps and trust in your instincts. The other aspect is that writing doesn't necessarily work in straight lines. Where do you draw your inspiration from for various characters? In fact, and I've spoken about this before, Nazneen, who's the protagonist of Brick Lane, she comes from a rural Bangladesh. She has an arranged marriage to Chanu, who's one of the other main characters, and they live in Tower Hamlets. Now, Nazneen, actually, I drew inspiration from my mother. Now, my mother is white English, and she made the opposite journey. She met my father in the UK. He was a student there. And then she followed him back to Dhaka, which, I mean, seems like if you meet my mum, she's like the most sort of quiet, reserved, very lovely, caring person. Doesn't seem like she would do something so passionate and reckless as to like travel halfway across the world to marry this man that she didn't know that well, frankly. Anyway, they got married. She didn't know anything. She didn't know the language. She didn't know much about the religion. She didn't know the culture. She didn't know anybody there. And she used to talk to me and my brother when we were children about that experience of total social and cultural dislocation that she experienced when she went to Dhaka and when she went to the village as well. People would come from all over to view her. They'd often never seen a white woman in the village, and people would come from far and wide to look at her. And I actually drew on that experience for Nazneen, that defamiliarization with the formal term. So you look at things through a sort of alien lens, like the Martian poetry, like what would a Martian think of a TV, or how would they see it? So it's what I'm saying is you don't know where characters come from often, and sometimes they don't come from the most obvious of sources.
And I also want to talk, Monica, about the books in between. So we've got these two, but then Monica's also written a number of books between Brick Lane and Love Marriage. And these books range from settings in Portuguese villages to the experience of immigrants at a hotel restaurant, to a fictional story that was inspired by the life of Princess Diana. And so what you didn't do, Monica, to your detractors' despair or dismay, is that you didn't stay in your lane.
No, I know, it's shocking.
And thank God you didn't, right? And you've quoted Roxane Gay about this situation, and who puts it very aptly and said, people tend to have a very singular narrative of who someone is. And so people of color, women of color, are only expected to write about identity-based things and the struggles of identity, because people get confused when you do anything else. And then just bear with me 1 second more, because Susan Fee then writes in the Financial Times about you and says, as subsequent novels appeared, it became clear that Ali was a different sort of novelist altogether, a more universal voice, a writer who disappeared entirely within the world of her fiction, confounding those who initially saw her as a mouthpiece for a particular constituency. So talk to us, Monica, about this pressure to perform brownness on and off the page and be some kind of flag bearer, for your kind. I mean, and you're obviously working against that and doing whatever a male white writer might want to do. Talk about that a little bit.
It's, it reminds me of, have you seen My Beautiful Laundrette by Hanif Qureshi?
I haven't.
Oh, there's a great line in that where one of the uncles of the protagonist says, this is the movie, and Hanif is, well, you know who Hanif is. Everyone knows who Hanif is. He says something like, I'm a professional businessman. I'm not a professional Pakistani. And that's, I'm a writer, not a professional brown person. That none of that is to say that, that I remember sort of references to, she's trying to get away from her background or her identity or from themes and issues in Brick Lane. And actually, that's sort of insulting, really, because what is it that I would be trying to get away from? And why would I want to get away from it? And again, it's hard for people to see the threads. I see the threads. So from Brick Lane to Untold Story, which is the book that you mentioned, based on, it's inspired by the life of Princess Diana. I remember being interviewed, it's actually in Russia, in Moscow, and the interviewer said, how on earth did you get from here to there? It's sort of bewildering. And I said, yeah, you're right. There's no similarities at all, because in Brick Lane, the protagonist is a virgin bride. She's uneducated, unworldly, has an arranged marriage to an older man, suffers the scrutiny of the wider community, has an affair, and decides that that isn't the way forward, and she reinvents herself in her life. Whereas completely different in Untold Story, Lydia, my fictional princess, is a virgin bride, uneducated, unworldly, arranged marriage to a much older man, suffers the scrutiny of the outside world, has an affair, etc. I mean, it's obviously partly I'm being a little bit facetious, but also I'm not. I mean, the things that I'm exploring, I'm serious about. So with Nazneen, she's just a brown woman in a sari, right? She's the kind of person that people might walk past the street in London and not really give her a second thought, not grant her full humanity, the full complexity of her interior life, which we all have. And in Untold Story, I mean, obviously there's a theme of celebrity and fame and so on. And I think there's something radically different and also very similar in that when somebody is so famous on such a global scale, we don't necessarily grant them their full humanity, the full complexity of their interior life. And there is something, sort of sad about that, and something to unearth and explore. And I've no idea whether I answered your original question now. Did I?
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
No, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I had that analogy between those two characters on my next question. So thank you so much. Now, one thing that was really heartening for me to learn, Monica, is that Brick Lane, I think, was or is still being taught to sixth form students. And you've said that there have been occasions where girls have said to you that they felt deeply seen and heard in these stories, and that one pupil, I think, actually sent you a story she'd written about the experience of reading Brick Lane in class, which included the line that never in her life had she felt so recognized.
Yeah.
Seeing yourself through such narratives, I mean, that can be a game changer for young girls, Monica.
Yeah, I mean, that is, it warms my heart. I mean, Brick Lane is an A-level set text, which is fantastic. I've done quite a few sessions now with sixth forms, particularly in London, but elsewhere as well, where there's a very diverse set of students, and that's been really gratifying, because it's coming to a new generation of readers who read it in a different way, who have really interesting questions to ask, who relate to Shahana and Bibi, their daughters, and then I think the story that you mentioned was actually a much younger girl. I think she was 12 or 13, and she says in this story that she's written, which is clearly herself, that she'd never been engaged with English lit classes, that she couldn't feel any connection with the characters and so on. And then one day, the teacher comes in with Brick Lane, and she wrote the story based on her experience of coming to the class and being able to actually see the point and see herself in the work. And if we think about if you don't see yourself reflected in the wider culture, I mean, that's something that's very difficult to deal with. I mean, in sort of, who doesn't see it? We think about monsters not seeing themselves, having no reflection, right? So I think that's a great thing if people start to feel that they're part of literature, that not only can they be part of it as readers, but it encourages them to become writers as well, hopefully.
Yeah. Monica, let's talk about the genre of the novel itself, and the novel in a time of Netflix particularly, and what makes it uniquely compelling at a time like this. Now, you've said that you find it hard to sometimes do press and media stuff because ultimately it feels a little fake, and you like writing with freedom and complexity and kind of the more layered form of writing. And that's why the novel form suits you and sound bites don't, which is a great way to put it. Now, of course, there's an alternative line of thinking which would say that the novel is near extinct in a time of Netflix, which doesn't look to be the case with this room right now, and that's reassuring. But there's still, of course, that line of thinking. Talk to us a little bit about what it is about the genre of the novel that you find appealing and that serves you in trying to tell the stories that you're seeking to tell.
Yeah, I mean, the novel has been declared dead many times over, hasn't it, from people from many different quarters, and yet somehow it still survives. I mean, it changes shape, it changes nature. Again, this morning we talked a little bit about the rise of autofiction, because of this nervousness about imagining the other, about appropriating stories, about not crossing cultural boundaries, all of that stuff which I think is absolutely integral and necessary to the art of the novelist. But that's a separate issue, perhaps, to the Netflix question. I mean, book sales are pretty healthy in the UK. But what we get is a lot of celebrity memoirs, a lot of cookbooks. Not that I'm dissing cookbooks, I like them too. Celebrity-penned novels, a lot of cozy crime. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people enjoy that. Literary fiction is having a hard time. I mean, let's be honest about it. There isn't a massive readership for most works of literary fiction. There just isn't. And you could argue that long-form storytelling has been partly some of the talent and consequently the interest has been sapped by the HBO long-form dramas, the Netflix long-form dramas, all of that. And I think that's a sort of reasonable argument. I mean, some of the writing on, anything from The Sopranos, Mad Men, all of those great shows, superb, and they deal with those very complicated characters. I think we've had peak Netflix, though. Netflix are in trouble. And the novel has been going for much, much longer, and I think people will come back around to it because in the end, with a TV show, you're much more of a passive consumer. Netflix and chill is what people say, and it's Netflix and chill for the reason that you're vegging out, you're switching off. Whereas when you're reading a novel, at least a good novel, you are doing part of the work because you're imagining and you're interpreting, you're reading the subtext as well as the text, and maybe it's more satisfying in the end. So I don't think that the novel is over. What do you think?
That's good news. No, I certainly agree. And in fact, that's a great segue into what I was going to ask you next, because I was going to talk about the relationship with readers when you're writing a novel. And Mohsin Hamid and Arundhati Roy put this so powerfully when they say that it's almost like inviting someone for a walk or a dance, because ultimately it's an act of co-creation. Where you're taking a reader's taking the words on the page and the power of their imagination, and then flying off with it. So I certainly agree with you, and I think that answers my next question. So thank you. Now, towards the end of the book, Monica, Yasmin says life is not simple. And God knows we know that's true. Yeah. But I specifically want to talk about this with relation to your own writing and writing challenges. Now, something that really struck me about what you said, Monica, was that the period after 2011 was challenging for you as a writer, and you'd stopped publishing due to a loss of confidence. And you've said that a good dose of self-doubt is essential, but a total loss of confidence can be quite disastrous. Now, what really struck me was just that shared vulnerability for someone like you to come out and talk about that and share in that sort of manner shouldn't be surprising, and yet it was in the best of ways. I want to ask you to talk to us a little bit about that time, but also coming out the other side, because you said you got depressed when you weren't writing, and so you found your way back in. But why is it so important for us to talk more about this? Because at the end, we see this on a bookshelf, and it feels glamorous, and it feels like there are fans all over the world, but you've pulled us backstage when you talk more honestly.
Yeah. Should we have a therapy session?
I would love that.
Well, I mean, that would be good. It's... I think, I'm generally an honest person, and I think pretending that everything is glowing and rosy isn't always helpful. And I know that I really had my children in mind as well when I talked about some of those struggles and difficulties that I had. I asked them first, how would you feel if I was this honest in public? And they were like, no, go for it, Mum. That people should be honest, and it's detrimental when you see just the glossy surface that you always see on social media, and everybody's doing fantastically well and their lives are perfectly curated, and, you know, the food they eat is beautiful and the clothes they wear are beautiful. You know, actually, we all have struggles. You know, that is just a reality. And writers have struggles as well. And if there's any, you know, I'm sure there's writers in the audience or people who've wanted to write and found it difficult to write. It's hard, right? And as you say, a bit of self-doubt is really essential to the writing process, because you don't want to be sitting there merrily tossing off, you know, all these lines that you're sure are fantastic, and you know, you want to test every sentence, every word, every paragraph, every page over and over again. And in order to do that, you need to doubt yourself. But to have a sort of total collapse of confidence, which I did, was just stopped me writing altogether. And I thought, that's one period of my life and I can just move on. And I did other things. But what got me back into writing, actually, was trying my hand. I was watching Netflix. I was watching a lot of TV, as depressed people sometimes do. And I thought, well, maybe I could write for the screen. And I, read a lot of scripts and so on. And I had loads of lunches with TV people. They're very good at giving you lunch and bullshitting you. And, I didn't do any unpaid work. I got paid for stuff. Nothing ever ended up on the screen. But you know what? I really had fun. I enjoyed learning something new. I always enjoy learning something new. And most of all, it reminded me that I need to be writing, no matter what. That in the end, it's the process for me and not the outcome. So that's what got me back to writing. And then it took me 4 years to write Love Marriage, and then it was another year or so. Publication takes quite a while. So that's what produced that long gap between Untold Story and Love Marriage. But I wasn't completely idle all the way in between, is what I'm trying to tell people.
Sure. So I'm going to open to the floor in a minute, but Monica, I've got one last question to ask you. A few years ago, at NYU, where I work, I heard a quote by a guest lecturer that we had, and I just want to get your reaction to it. And it's a quote by Sir Henry David Thoreau, but this is a mashed-up version of it. And it said something like, most men and women lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them. So he said, most men and women lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them. Now, the world has seen too much, we continue to see too much, we'll remember too much, and yet Love Marriage is not devoid of hope. That thin ray of hope still streams through. Talk to us a little bit about what you as a storyteller, in a time with so much quiet desperation, think of as your song, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Well, one thing for me is always humour. So, I can write about quite serious, challenging topics, but for me, the thing that gets me through is always seeing things through a lens of humour, and there's, hopefully that shines through in the book. So that's what does it for me.
Great. Okay, so we're going to open up to the floor. I also want to just remind you that there will be a book signing that's going to take place in Hall 3 at Adabi Betak. So we're open to the floor now. If you've got, there's a lady right there in the middle. So if you could get her a mic.
Thank you, Saba. Great moderation. Monica, it's a pleasure to see you in Lahore. Could you tell us if there is potentially a book in you that explores history a bit of Bangladesh and Pakistan, considering East Pakistan, West Pakistan? Your parents coming in from Dhaka a bit, parallels with some history, or how much of this literature did you engage with? Is it about Karachi, families from Bengal still there, their struggles? Would there be something of a book coming out of you in that aspect?
That's a good question. I mean, other writers obviously have written about the Liberation War, the Civil War. Tamim Moranam, of course, has written quite extensively about it. I don't know. It's not on my radar right now, but it's something that I've always read about. I've got many books on the topic. I'd have to wait for the right characters to come to me and spin it out from that. And to date, those characters haven't come to me. But, you know, who knows? In the future, that could be.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Yes. Yeah, but I think we'll have a mic brought to you. We can hear you, though. Yeah.
Hello, that was so insightful, and I absolutely loved Love Marriage.
Oh, thank you.
So the question we all have is about motherhood. Motherhood in your novels, and motherhood personally. As Virginia Woolf says, room of one's own. You need to have money and means to write. So how did you navigate that space of a daily life and then saying, right, this is my writing time, do not disturb? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, that is a really crucial question for, you know, so many women writers. I was also, when I started writing Brick Lane, I was also inspired by that quote from Cyril Connolly, that grand old man of British letters, about the pram in the hall being the enemy of creativity. And I thought, you know, up yours, Cyril Connolly. I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to do it anyway. But so I'm quite bloody-minded. But it is hard. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And the only way of writing is to be incredibly determined and to have something that you are burning to say, to explore, to question, to, you know, if the motivation for me was merely pretty words and pretty sentences, I think I would give up quite quickly because I've still got constraints as a mother. I mean, my kids are grown up, but they've both moved back home, and it's a full house, and my son's got his girlfriend there, and it's all crazy, and you know, it's very hard for me to find the space to write. And the only reason that I find the space to write is because there are intellectual, social, political, cultural questions that I want to dive into and that I feel compelled to dive into. If there was anything else that I could do but write, I think I would choose not to write. I mean, I'm reminded of that Dorothy Parker quip, which is also very truthful. You know, the biggest favor that you can do for any aspiring writer is to shoot them now while they're still happy. So sorry, I mean, the bottom line is it's hard.
Can I ask a naive question, please? When people fall in love with each other, obviously they don't conduct a survey in the whole country that who suits who. So obviously people meet just a few people and then they get emotionally attached with one of them. So don't you think what we call is love is kind of irrational decision? Don't you think it would be much better that if people evaluate each other from a distance before getting emotionally involved and keeping an objective approach, and if that is the basis of the relationship between two human beings, then don't you think that relationship will be more kind of everlasting, and that would be probably the solution of these, you know, so many divorces? Would you agree with this, please? Thank you.
Can I agree? Or disagree? If there's an option to disagree. You know, it's interesting. Of course, there is a very high divorce rate in the West where everybody chooses their own partner, and we have all these romantic ideas about love conquering all and so on. What's also interesting at the moment, I mean, now I have to confess that I watch some trashy TV. I'm going to blame my daughter. She loves this program called Married at First Sight. And there's one set in Australia, there's one set in the UK. And the idea is that this panel of experts find single people who are compatible on paper. And then they meet the first time at the altar. I mean, a bit like a traditional arranged marriage. And then they have to live together, and then they meet each other's families and friends and all of this stuff. And of course, it's sort of, the whole thing is terrible, manipulative, trashy TV at its worst. But what's compelling about it is that idea that maybe we don't know for ourselves who is the best person, and that is why they're conducting this experiment. So, you know, maybe things will come full circle. I don't think so, by the way. But it's interesting that despite all the freedom to choose whoever you like, and there's endless choice of you flick right on the Tinder or the whatever, maybe that is what is actually inculcating this interest in a different form of dating, which is ending up weirdly as a trash TV format. So I neither agree nor disagree, but it's interesting to observe.
So you mentioned that writing can be hard, and how did you get the motivation and the inspiration to take the very first steps of starting to write a book, or, you know, get the figments of your imagination into writing?
How do you get the inspiration?
Yeah.
You know, my top tip for any aspiring writer, I mean, the top 3 things you need to do. Number 1, read. Number 2, read. And number 3, read. I mean, that you don't need to pay for an expensive creative writing course, in my view, although I've taught on them. And you can get something from those courses, but if you don't have access to those, all you need is a library card, like I had. And that's the best way of teaching yourself, as it were, to write. In terms of inspiration, you know, where do you get your ideas from? Well, the more I engage with the world, the conversations I have, the plays that I see, the places that I travel to, the people that I talk to, the plays that I go and see, you know, all of those things actually feed into your base material as a writer, and never just disregard what's around you either. Quite often it's in front of your nose. You know, quite often what's in front of your nose and within your family is a very good place to, you know, as a springboard for your imagination.
Okay, well, Monica, thank you so much. We're out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Saba.
Thank you.